Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Redpill, joined as always by Dr. Benway. And Dr. Benway, what's on the docket for today?
We're hopefully going to try and discuss what was the madness in the 20th century that we convinced ourselves that journalism was somehow a respectable career.
Yeah, I have some theories about that. Yeah, because what's going on is that the press they're starting to show their true colors, right? And I have a few ideas as to what's been going on. And I think that you do too. And Benway and I have not discussed what each thinks of what's going on, not in any detail. And so I think that this is going to be a fun conversation about this issue. See, the Tim Wu, the book, The Attention Merchants, it's a pretty shitty book, but it does have the opening chapters are kind of riveting because it talks about the evolution of journalism. And journalism really started in the 19th century. Before that, people would just publish pamphlets with what they thought, with their ideas or what they wanted to have happen. All the Federalist Papers, for instance, they were all like pamphlets that were privately printed and distributed, either sold or given away. And that was the business at the time of pamphleteering. But the notion of a newspaper really developed, it seems, in the 19th century. Especially the daily newspaper, especially the daily that would talk about all the gory details going on at the police station and so forth. That started in New York. And Tim Wu does a pretty masterful job of giving a description of that background. Don't you think?
Yes. I mean, I think another way of describing what we would think of as the press prior to the 19th century was another way of saying blogs. Right. I mean, You can look back at those pamphlets. You can look back at the writings of Samuel Johnson, Thomas Paine, pick your poison. They were one of two things. Either they were personal opinions shared around, or it was the local club, political or meeting group, or some sort of organization that published what it thought. Right. And it was meant as that it has its perspective and it sells out. What Wu pointed out is, okay, when did the business of journalism start? Well, it was around the time that someone figured out the process by which, rather than charging people in the street the total cost of the newspaper, everything that you were doing to put articles in there, they thought, well, what we really need is ads, and that can reduce the cost to the people I sell on the street, because the people with ads want attention, hence the attention merchants. And the more people who read shit, the better. I forget the name of the guy who really propagated that, but he realized that basically what gets eyes on newspapers is lurid shit.
Yeah.
If it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah, exactly.
Some guy, cut off a woman's head and then fucked her neck, and that shit, that I mean, I don't really exaggerate. Shit like that is what they covered. And that's where you get the notions of these like yellow dog journalism and all of this, lurid shit, and people really not respecting the news, but also feel fundamentally the need to read it again. After a certain point in time when that kept going on and on and on, suddenly we reinvented the notion that, in reality, it's this press, and it's probably because of the muckrakers who were kind of a unique little breed, because the press is investigating things and, shining a light on the world. Somehow these guys who are literally just a half generation earlier, saying, hey, look at the woman who sawed off her husband's head and then, shoved his neck in her pussy. Suddenly those are the guys holding, truth to, or putting truth to power and all of that business. You know what I mean? And then, and from that context, you suddenly say, well, these are the reputable, the fourth pillar, the fourth estate, the fourth pillar of government. And yeah, it's a little bit of a stretch, isn't it?
Well, it seems what's happened is that during the mid-20th century, there was World War II. There was the Depression and World War II. And then the whole McCarthy period. Now, I think that all of these sort of like combine, because during the Depression and World War II, journalists started being more reputable. they started reporting like during the Depression of what was actually going on and how bad things were going. And because before that, in the 20s and before, during the war, the First World War, the press were basically propagandists. They would just report wherever the governments were telling them, and it was very clear. That's why so many of the post World War I writers had such an impact because they started telling the truth. And I think that we're going to be doing an episode on that on all the post World War I writers and the so-called lost generation writers and memoirists and what have you. And what happened was that those writers were the first who were telling the truth because during the war, the press were just propagandists. They were just repeating whatever the powers that be told them to repeat or say. And so it was during the Depression that they started earning credibility because they started reporting as to what was actually happening during the Depression, especially because during World War I, there had been, and after, there was so much criticism of journalism that they had been just reporting bullshit. So during the Depression, they were starting to tell the truth. During World War II, they were telling the truth. And then McCarthy hit, Edward R. Murrow, and that whole thing. And what seems clear is that that's when the press during the 50s and 60s, it started gaining enormous credibility, and it sort of like culminated, I would go so far as to say, during the Bernstein and Woodward period with Watergate, that the press were like these noble, valiant paladins for justice and truth and goodness, which is just bullshit, right? And not what they were, just ambulance chasers. They were just chasing a story.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it was a successful business model for a long time, predicated on things like, the brain tonics of the time, getting their ads in the paper and telling people, oh, you're suffering from these life-threatening maladies, like, drink this motor oil and sugar that
Yeah.
I've put together, and you're going to live through the night kind of thing. And, and you had that business model, but eventually in that mid-century, you notice a lot of times like the publishers or the owners of the newspaper suddenly become these, wealthy dowager women or very wealthy men who feel like, oh, I am going to be the guarantor of these news in this area. And they're still, in some cases making money from those newspapers, but, that they had that attitude like, oh, this is my, civic responsibility that I make sure that the Chicago Tribune is publishing, or more importantly, the Wall Street Journal. Well, I forget what her face was who owned it and
Babe
ran it.
Paley? No. I forget.
I forget
Graham.
her name.
Kathleen Graham?
Yeah, yeah, that sounds right. And Paley was CBS.
Yeah.
But you had that kind of generation going, and then eventually, as things so often happen,
The
in
money dried up.
80s and 90s, people said, oh, you know what? We can make and show publicly traded big gains at these newspapers by, consolidating staff, cutting things down. All of these apparatuses of the newspaper that was built in the 60s and 70s or even 50s and earlier about all of this reputableness. Suddenly, hey, we don't need all of that shit. We can show some nice quick returns, make some quick bucks of money. Eventually, all of that apparatus goes away because he gutted it out to sell it. And as a result, the newspaper recently, I think what you've seen is not so much that they've suddenly populated by mean people. It's more that the paper is going back to its traditional roots, which is chasing after people who cut off heads and fuck the neck. You know what I mean?
Also being I think that what's interesting is that in the post-war period, in the United States at least, in the Western democracies, on the one hand, there was this acknowledgement that the Soviet Union did represent a threat, an existential threat. And so the news was more important. And during that time also, they were making so much goddamn money from ads. From the revenue was astronomical. They could afford to have somebody like Hunter Thompson around and foot the bill for his craziness. They could afford to have investigative journalists going 6 months into some project in order to get the prestige because they had the money. But as the money started drying up in the aughts and the teens of this century because of the internet, then all that got cut and things started getting a lot more salacious and a lot more partisan. And also there's a thing too, is that back in the 50s and 60s, the press has always been traditionally left, which I've never quite understood. I want to get into this in a little bit, but they were traditionally on the left in the 50s and 60s and 70s, but they sort of like submerged it and sort of like almost pretended to be right wingers. They weren't so avowedly left wing. It only really flowered with Nixon and when they crucified Nixon. And the right at that time was politically and ideologically weak. So they didn't have a real answer to the left crucifying Nixon, because that's what they did. I mean, Nixon was actually a pretty good president, and the shit that went down insofar as Watergate, I mean, it's just pathetic and trivial in the overall scheme of things. But they crucified him because they hated him. That's as simple as that. They just did not like the man. It's not complicated. But the left got away with all this shit. But then there was the two issues I would say. The resurgent right, starting with Reagan, who started like getting like a right that had balls, or at least pretended to have balls. Let's not talk about the current GOP. But anyway, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, you had the loss of revenue of the 21st century because of the internet. And I think that's when the mask fell off. You tell me if you disagree. That the mask of civility of these fuckers came off.
Well, I mean, it's funny you'd mentioned that they could afford to fund the antics of Hunter Thompson. I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to bring it up, and I was going to bring up a few other people, namely the likes of your Joan Didions,
Yeah,
Gay
sure.
Talese, Tom Wolfe, because what's happening there is somewhat interesting. That isn't so much, funding journalism as much as you're funding a literary exercise. I'm not afraid to cite the fact that people said that Hunter Thompson's account of the 72 election campaign was simultaneously the most truthful and least factual
Yeah,
account of that campaign.
yeah,
What is that? That tells you it's a literary exercise, and that also tells me that the business was doing so well that they were funding these exercises. Yeah, those exercises probably could have, in certain circumstances, paid off for them, but it was a little bit of a novelty. The business was such that it could afford to do that, right? And so with the good times, what they were, you had a nice 50-year period, let's say, of saying, "Oh, look, we're all." It's like we're funding the opera house,
yeah,
we're funding the theater, kind of thing. And then eventually that dries up, and those authors kind of continue to do their own thing, but under their own auspices almost, and everybody else goes back to the old ways. In terms of it's interesting you mentioned the politics of this. I think our take on the journalism here is very an American centric thing, largely because in Britain you don't really have this problem. Not to say that there aren't newspapers in Britain, there are, but they all openly have their biases and everybody knows it,
right.
and it's just understood. Whereas America had this long period of the journalists portraying themselves as objective truth seekers, but it's interesting. Yeah, there may very well be a left-wing bias. There may be a Democratic Party bias, call it what you will. But at the same time, it's also a consensus bias. I mean, we don't have to think too far back. Think of the Iraq War. There was by and large, a conclusion made within the press apparatus outside of things like The Nation or what have you that, oh, yeah, the war is fine. Here, Time Magazine does their fucking graphics on how Saddam's weapons of mass destruction could be buried and how they're moving across the country as if they had like tactical maps of how it was all happening.
Yeah.
And that consensus building kind of maintained. They certainly served their function on that front. And it seems to come all crashing down now, does it?
Well, yeah, it's all like nobody takes them seriously anymore because there have been too many lies. And the normies, I mean, you and I who are like more on the bleeding edge of this shit, right? We haven't believed the press in years, right? But the normies are starting to finally catch on that the press is full of shit because they see what the press is reporting and the reality around them. And there is a severe mismatch. Like I said in the opening video of my YouTube channel, I said about getting red pilled, right? What is getting red pilled? It's when you recognize the difference between the narrative and the truth. And the elite narrative, which is what the press peddles, is so far from the truth of what's going on in the Western democracies that it's absurd, and people realize that it's just propaganda. And they react against it because nobody likes it when you're getting lied to. Nobody likes it. I want to ask you this because this is a question that I'm. Why is it that American press, at least, are so fucking left wing? Even though you would think that the press would be more in touch with people and would have a more jaundiced, more cynical view of human nature and recognize human flaws and would, because of it, turn more conservative. Why do you think that the press isn't like that? At least the American press isn't like that.
Well, I think they probably had more sympathy to that kind of jaundiced, kind of cynical view back during the 70s,
Or
maybe the 80s and
40s, yeah.
50s and 40s. Well, largely because it was a profession whereby someone could actually make a living. And so when someone has, in some sense, they're a journalist, but they have their shit in order and they're running the beat,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they see, they see a guy who, stuck his wife in a microwave because she gave him tuna casserole one too many times for the night. Yeah, those guys had a cynical view about human nature, but those guys got ran out of the business because they were too expensive. And so what happens now, and why I think people are noticing this left-wing bias seems to be getting larger, whiter,
Yeah.
more annoying, is frankly because the living that you're going to make from this business is a little bit narrower. The older guys who are kind of raising a family on it are kind of disappearing fast. And so you're left with people who are getting into this business because they can't or won't do anything else. And it's not going to, people who can do, who are looking for something to make their career because they're just capable men and women, they've left. They go into other businesses. So you're left with a group of people here who probably feel like something's owed to them, that they're just kind of annoyed with, that society isn't thinking the right way, that isn't caring about them the right way. And as a result, you get a lot of resentment, and resentment tends to be left wing, frankly.
Yeah. 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 I'm thinking that you might be
Whereas
right.
I think like you mentioned, Nixon. Nixon's an interesting case. I think the resentment of Nixon for a lot of people probably felt a little less political. I'm sure it it manifested itself that way. I suspect that was a resentment of a, for lack of a better term, country boy who doesn't look well put together, who doesn't look like a nice professional man. So the guy who didn't go to the right schools. Like, remember, this is at a time when Woodward and Bernstein. Woodward's a Harvard or a Yale graduate, I forget which
Yeah.
one.
Yale.
And there's a number of Yaleys and Harvardites in the newspaper business. Gene Siskel, I think, was a Yaley
Yeah.
or a Harvard. Well, if those guys are getting into the news business, goddamn well there's money to be made there. And I think they looked on this guy as, well, he's not as put together as us.
Yeah, he's déclassé.
So I think that was certainly a unique piece of it there. And they certainly didn't like Spiro Agnew, who was very intelligent and could easily dismantle their bullshit very quickly. Nobody likes to be made to look a fool, especially if you went to Harvard, Yale, Princeton. So I think that that was the two-edged prong there. So it may be a little bit oblique to politics, so certainly you could think of it in a political lens.
Well, how could I put this? The press, there's also the other problem that started to emerge, I think, in the 60s, and that became a real issue, it seems, was how starting in the 60s, you started to have these superstar anchormen. You had it you had it before in the 50s and the 40s and the 30s even, right? The superstar journalists, but they were paid reasonably. It wasn't outlandish. They were paid maybe a bit more than the regular beat reporter. But then you had Edward R. Murrow, who was like a star, and he commanded a big audience, so he started getting paid more. And then you had Mike Wallace. The Mike Wallace interview was like a big deal, and you got 60 Minutes, and then the anchor with Walter Cronkite. He started becoming like a star in his own right. And the news about him, I mean, what was happening to his career, for instance, that became newsworthy. And then, when Cronkite was replaced by Dan Rather, that was like a big deal. And he was getting paid a lot of money. It was on Time magazine. They called him the $5 million man or the $8 million man. I forget how much it was. Right? It was on the cover. His salary was on the cover of Time magazine when he took over in '83 or whenever it was. Um, it became like a thing, and they started getting huge salaries. I think that Matt Lauer at the end of it was getting like 25, 30 million a year, or perhaps more. I don't recall, but I mean it was up there. It was the eight figures, comfortable eight figures, and this kind of superstardom where you have these news stars, and of course, a news star, in order to remain a star, has to be as milquetoast as possible, as uncontroversial as possible, and it just creeped me out. I think it just became unbalanced, an unbalanced environment. Where
What also kind of what because that feels like a thing of the past a little bit. Like I mean, Tucker is certainly doing well in our circle and objectively just doing well, but that's kind of a unique case in some regard. I think the anchors you're talking about. What's funny to me is they all kind of died out in that respectability angle fairly quickly and fairly consistently through self-induced means. Remember what was Dan Rather had that news report? Was it against George Bush, who
yeah,
claimed things about his, I don't know if it was his military service or something that were proven to be factually inaccurate, so he lost his job over that. Uh, Brian Williams did the whole, like I was being shot at, from
yeah,
40 directions, that killed his credibility. Bill O'Reilly, with his loofah sponges and what other else things he was doing. All that shit happened, fairly within a short period of time, right? So eventually you get to this point where like nobody really has anchors that have that charismatic role or people find fairly trustworthy, right? So that kind of position of the pillar of society, because we all, are watching them at the same time. Walter Cronkite was Walter Cronkite largely because enough people were watching him when he said, after the Tet Offensive, the war in Vietnam is all over, kind of thing. Well, when 40% of the country is watching you, it's easy for people to look up to you.
yeah, yeah.
When about 10% or less are watching you, it's not so convincing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because 40% of the public were watching Walter Cronkite, and uh, the press. Okay, let's step away from this issue and step a little bit in the macro direction. The press. It seems to me that this is how I see it. You tell me if I'm wrong. It's sort of like during the 19th century, they were just scum of the earth kind of people, and they were just chasing the news stories, and if it bleeds, it leads kind of thing. And then there was this blip of respectability during the 50s and 60s and 70s. And it sort of like continued the afterglow of this, continued on into the 80s and 90s. But then as the money started to dry up because ads started going in two directions. Number one, with the proliferation of cable during the 80s and then 90s and the different media that became available, advertising dollars started to swim away from print and news and go into these other avenues of distribution. Because do keep in mind, before cable, the advent of cable, there were only, three channels and whatever local stations were going on in your market. That was it. But then cable brought you 30 channels. And, the advertising dollars went there. And they left the news, they left the print news, and then in the 2000s and the teens, with the proliferation of the internet, that's the kiss of death for the whole industry. And so they've sort of like both reverted to a more base version and a more ideological version, because the only ones who can afford to be journalists are trust fund babies who have an ideological bent because of their education. Would that be a reasonable summation of the growth, development, and loss of prestige of news? Am I
I mean,
missing something?
I think that's a fair case to be made for that. I think their prestige of the journalists started probably a little bit earlier. Like I said, I think this notion of the journalist comes a little bit from the muckraker period, and then kind of really blossoms into the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. I think in addition to just hey, there are other sources of entertainment available, and I stress the word entertainment because at the end of the day, people look at these things for entertainment as opposed to information. I think, at least for newspapers, it's hard not to look at what was going on in the 90s and saying, oh, we don't need all of these beat reporters. Oh, we don't need all of this apparatus that makes the process of treating news as it's a sacred bond by which we have this information, we verify it, and all of those other things. The more that kind of gets hollowed out, the less you can make a case for respectability. And the more that happens, the more the pressures that you indicated of, rival entertainment become, the de facto governing power. To me, I think the big signpost, or at least for me, I mean, I can't say that it's representative for everyone. The big signpost that the all of the effects you had mentioned, all the effects I had mentioned, which is the gutting out of the apparatus of the news, the rivalry of the internet, really kind of summarized everything so perfectly when CNN, just prior to the 2016 election, I think this happened in like 2015, maybe even 2014, but by 2015, they hired and poached most of the BuzzFeed political editorial staff. They became the new people running CNN. Now some people will say like, oh, there you go, CNN's left-wing bias. I mean, yes, certainly it's left-wing bias, but I think there's something more important at play. CNN was looking at those numbers of BuzzFeed, which at the time, remember, those it wasn't a few years ago, whereas BuzzFeed was all like, oh, if you were a child in the 80s, you'd remember these 15 things, and it was like pictures of stupid shit. That was BuzzFeed's business model, is to like just get asses to realize that, oh, nostalgia brings us all together. And they got a lot of views. That that whole channel was, that site was built by a Marxist grad student who knew a lot about sociology and incorporated it into his understanding of how you can get people to do shit. And CNN just looked at those numbers and said, I want that.
Yeah,
I want to compete with that.
Yeah.
Let's have it for the news. And all of the annoying thing you think about CNN, yes, it's left-wing, but more importantly, it's the BuzzFeedification of the news.
Well, I don't know about the BuzzFeed. Oh, well, yeah. I mean, that specific case, sure. But what I have noticed is that, see, news originally was propaganda. I mean, starting back with the pamphleteers. Pamphleteers were propagandists. They were bloggers, as you put it. Very well put, actually. And then they sort of like, if it leads, it bleeds kind of thing. And then they were sort of like during World War I, they were propagandists. And then there was this period of time when they pretended to themselves, because they were rich, that they were, the bulwarks in defense of truth and justice and the American way or some shit like that, right? And now they're kind of like sinking back to the level from whence they came. It has the shape of, those families where there's one guy who makes a big fortune and his son sort of like builds on that, and then the grandson is just not so capable, and the great grandson is sort of like a spendthrift, and the great grandson winds up back in the gutter. It's sort of like that kind of evolution. That's kind of cyclical rise and fall kind of thing. And I'm kind of gleeful because I don't like the fact that, like, the New York Times is holding on for dear life to this idea it has of it being the newspaper of record, as they love to call themselves, right? I'm glad that that's dying off. And I can't wait for the New York Times to go belly up. The only reason they're still around is because of their fucking building. Because, they're actually still worth something as a company because of the building that they own. But yeah, I can't wait for them to go under.
Well, this is why it's kind of humorous to me when I hear people in the press say any kind of negative statements against them is, one more chip in the wall that is the collapse of the American Republic and liberalism as initiated in the sense the founding of our country. I laugh at that because nothing anywhere close to the New York Times existed during the writing of the Constitution. In fact, if you think of what they meant by the freedom of the press, what they really meant was freedom of groups, associations, and bloggers to have their pamphlets.
Yeah.
That's all it was. There was not, freedom of the New York Times to completely sully a man's reputation and pretend like, oh, it's, nothing happened,
Oopsie.
or be able to, take all of these whatever government papers they feel they have access and right to, and then say we don't have the right, we don't have the obligation to reveal our sources and all of that. They're talking about a bureaucratic apparatus which was not even conceived at the time. The whole Constitution is constructed with, frankly, small groups of people and organizations. It's not necessarily a big newspaper apparatus. And so, this reconstruction of history to always say we're somehow the emblems of what's good and true, you always have to take with a grain of salt, which is why
A boulder of salt, yeah.
a boulder, which is why I always say, whenever someone says, "Oh, we need to," we're the true representatives of this, that, or the other. You just have to go back and say, okay, when did these guys really start saying this shit and under what context?
Yeah,
it's like the notion that like America was always a melting pot. That's a 19th century concept,
late 19th century concept. Yeah. Well, my thinking about the whole about the press is when you're rich, one of the first things you buy is class. When you're nouveau riche, what does a nouveau riche do? He buys elocution classes, and he hires somebody to teach him manners, table manners, and he goes and gets himself an expensive suit so that he looks the part, right? And it seems to me that the press they came into a lot of fucking money when TV and radio came on the scene. They made a lot of goddamn money during the 50s and 60s, and they bought themselves a hell of a lot of class and a hell of a lot of prestige. And when the money dried up, that's all they've been left with. And they're trying to shore up that empty prestige with all they've got. And they're trying to use that prestige of glory days long gone to shore up their political biases, quite frankly. That's all I see. I see just political bias. And I think that the people they're scum. And the thing that also bothers me the most about them is that they are so incompetent. See, they are so fucking backwards. They don't see things. They don't understand things. They either mislabel people or put them in a category that they don't belong in, or just don't understand the nuance of whatever given situation they land at. They hear a few things here and there, a few buzzwords, a few catchy and interesting terms of a particular business or a particular situation, and they publish that, and they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. That's what bothers me. I mean, like what's been going on now, with the reporting of like Sargon of Akkad and stuff. I find it amusing on a personal level that Sargon is being called an alt-right. I mean, I find it hilarious, right? But by the same token, see, these people aren't doing it out of malice. They're doing it out of incompetence. They don't realize what's going on. And they just, they think that they do. And they have that arrogance of the stupid. Because at the end of the day, who is going into journalism? Who's going into journalism? Stupid guys, second raters, guys who can't cut it, guys who Goldman Sachs does not want to hire. Those are the people going into journalism. The first raters, they don't go to journalism. They go into consulting or investment banking or whatever the hell, right? And so it's sort of like, these second raters, third raters, so many of them. And they're using prestige, drawing on prestige that they didn't earn to shore themselves up. And you see them on Twitter, like little fucking scurrying little cockroaches on Twitter. And you're like, what the fuck, man? You know what I mean?
Well, there was not too long ago. It was actually earlier this week. I showed you that story of, I forget her name. It was a Sky News broadcaster.
Yeah. Let me look it up real quick.
Yeah. Well, you're looking it up. She had one hell of a week, I'll tell you. She, over the weekend, oversaw a debate between a conservative MP who was kind of a pro-Brexiteer of some kind, and a Labour MP who is anti-Brexit of some kind. It was a typical shit show of the English woman saying, my constituency didn't vote for being out of employment and all these other bad things. Brexit is just hurting our people. And the conservative MP is just literally trying to respond to her, and she's talking over him, and he finally loses his cool and says, tell you what, You keep talking. I'm going to pull out my phone and do something productive. And he starts looking at it. And then this journalist suddenly kicks in and says, yeah, oh, wait, you can't disrespect her that way. I don't want you on this show no more. And then, all big drama. And everybody starts saying, this journalist, what are you do your fucking job of moderating this debate? Well, she then proceeded in an endless tirade on Twitter of saying, you guys didn't see the whole interview. You're just assholes. I'm right. You look at all of the misogyny on Twitter. You see what we have to put up with. And then to top it all off, she then writes and posts some sort of article to the effect of, journalists shouldn't be talking smack about each other. We should be sticking together.
This is the line. There are enough people wanting to criticize journalists. We shouldn't turn on each other. Kay Burley was this bitch, by the way. Yeah, and go on. What happened after that?
Well, and people continue to mock her deservedly. And here's the thing that's interesting. If it's a simple rule to any journalists who might be listening, if you don't want people calling you criminals or the enemy of the people, stop operating under the rules of Muerta like gangsters. If you don't want people to think you're criminals, stop acting like them. It's a very simple concept.
No, and the funny thing was that, see, this this is all happening in the context of this journalist who journalist from Der Spiegel, who turned out to be faking all of his stories. This guy, I'm looking up his name. Der Spiegel, the great German news magazine, said that Klaas Relotius committed journalistic fraud on a grand scale, quote unquote. Der Spiegel this guy got a Journalist of the Year award from CNN, and it's turning out that a whole bunch of his stories were outright fabrications. I mean, like Ira Glass kind of fabrication kind of thing. This is a young guy.
Stephen Glass. Ira Glass hosts This American Life. I think you mean like
Stephen Glass. Stephen Glass. Sorry, my mistake. Not Ira. Stephen Glass. Stephen Glass, who famously made up a bunch of stories, and they made an actually pretty good movie about him with Hayden Christensen in the role. It was not a bad picture, actually. And this guy, Klaas Relotius, apparently is the same thing. 33 years old, good-looking guy. He looks like a, blonde, blue-eyed, Germanic, thin, tall, and big fat liar. And it's so goddamn funny. These press guys, they're just... Well, the thing is, see, when I was growing up, I knew some people who despised the press, and they said that all of them were just, ambulance chasers, and they considered them all on the level of National Enquirer journalists. They saw no difference between them. And when I was growing up, I thought, oh, no, there is a difference. The ones who are like in corporate news and Time Magazine, they're like higher echelon. They're like better, right? But now, nah. The ones on the higher end, they just have more money.
They just taste bigger ambulances.
Bigger ambulances and nicer suits, but they're basically the same thing.
Think about it. Like, the other kind of fun thing I always love is when people say, oh, why do you need journalism? Because they relay important information. Are journalists little more than replayers of the newswire feed? And in some sense, that's what it is. Remember the line that's often said about journalists relative to politics is probably some of the reason they don't hold feet to the fire of a lot of politicians you'd expect them to do is because, that's their sources, right? They wine and dine all of the political establishment media because they want to say, I'll give you a little piece of gossip here about, unnameable sources. Back on the down low, I can tell you about all of these things. Well, that's just, giving little shit stories from one guy to give shit to the other guy so that maybe one guy gets fired and he gets promoted. It's all that kind of jibber jabber business at the end of the day, right? So, that is in some sense an ambulance chasing kind of thing. Because what am I getting at through all of the variations of what we're talking through here? At no point in time, even when you were sniffing your farts so deeply you thought you were on God's green earth, it was entertainment.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
Yeah. It's entertainment. Yeah. Entertainment designed to sell ads. That's
even Edward R. Murrow, the greatest, this is the first man who really showed us what it meant to be an honorable journalist. He was interviewing Liberace, asking him, "Hey, when are you going to find a wife, Liberace?
Yeah.
When are you going to get married?"
Yeah.
"Oh, I don't know.
Yeah. He
Maybe my brother
coyly said,
George."
yeah.
Yes,
Oh
exactly.
man, it's so. I think that that's the thing, too. I think that, at least in my own case, realizing how full of shit they always were, but that they could gussy it up with money, just just makes me find them even more contemptible. I saw that movie, The Post. I don't know if you saw it, the one with Meryl Streep and Tanya Hanks, who played Katharine Graham and Ben Bradley
Yeah.
during the Watergate period, right? And actually, no, the Pentagon Papers. And I thought that the movie was, first of all, it was like so full of shit. It was kind of like a Me Too kind of thing that it was so pathetically pandering to the Me Too thing. I don't know if you watched it, but there are a couple of scenes in it where Katharine Graham is walking along, and all these women who look right out of United Colors of Benetton, but dressed up in 70s clothes kind of thing and 70s haircuts, right? They're just staring at her adoringly, like, oh, you're the woman, you will lead us into the promised land, like fucking Moses or some shit like that, right? And, totally anachronistic. And at the time, of course,
Half the journalists would be saying to themselves, "Why am I putting up with this cunt?" That's exactly what they would have said.
yeah, yeah. And it was just embarrassing. And it gussied up that whole thing as if it were like better. How could I put it? They're just base people with a lot of money, That's all it was. Base people who got a lot of money because of an accident of their industry. They weren't even particularly clever. That's the thing. I think that what bothers me the most. They got lucky. They were at a period where the hard work had been done for them by previous generations, and they lucked into all the money and all the prestige. And yeah, their psychic descendants, or call it what your spiritual descendants rather. Today, they sort of like try to feed at that same trough, and well, there's no food, so there's no feeding, but they still have the prestige, or they try to hold on to it. Oh man, I just.
Well, here's the liberating fact of this, though, is the fact that the older structures are returning, which is okay. The main big business media are back to what they used to be, the true, unambiguous bullshit ambulance chasers. But the real investigators, where are they? They're back to the pamphleteering.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that. And the way you support them is, frankly, directly financing them, engaging them, buying their content, whatever you go about doing it. That's just as fine, frankly. And I know someone will say, "Oh, with the fact checking and this and that," go to any New York Times story, pick one at random. I guarantee you, every single one of those stories is going to have a correction at the bottom.
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
And the thing is, see, also, I mean, turning our attention to the present, there are a lot of guys who are making really incredible journalism, and that you can really respect. I mean, like We Are Change, Luke Rutkowski's outfit, right? He's going to places, Tim Pool, he's been saying that he's putting together money to do a mobile, like news reporting mobile, right? Basically like a van with all his gear so he can drive around from place to place and hit the news, right? You got Lauren Southern, who's done one really amazing documentary, Farmlands, about South Africa. And she went on the ground and interviewed people in South Africa. A really extraordinary documentary. And she's prepping to release the next one, I think. I think it's to be released, right? And yeah, she's doing real journalism, okay? And the funny thing is that, see, these real journalists, they're the ones getting their funding cut. Okay, when they put up a Patreon page, they get cut. They cut Lawrence Southern last year, right? They're all these guys, Luke Rutkowski, Tim Pool, Lawrence Southern. Who else is out there? I mean, there are a number of guys who are out there.
Yeah, the audience knows it. We don't have to list it
and
off.
so
for them,
what's cool about them is that they are the real deal, and they have a credibility. And frankly, on my end at least, a respect that the journalists of all the establishment media today, fuck them. I can't take them seriously. I mean, I look at a news organization like Zero Hedge, right? Zero Hedge is the perennial, the sky is falling kind of outfit. They're perennially bearish. Gold is going to shoot the moon. Stocks are falling, bonds are falling, the end is nigh. Kind of thing. Okay, well, fine. That's their editorial stance, I suppose. Rather than being political, it's pessimistic. I think that pessimism is their politics. But anyway, the thing is, see, they are the best financial reporting outfit out there, general reporting outfit. I mean, that gives you the global perspective of what's going on in finance and in a lot of current events. Their posts, they put out, I don't know, a dozen or so, maybe a dozen and a half posts a day, and every one of them is a grabber. It's either, inherently interesting and funny, or it has something that is really useful and good to know, or it gives you some tidbit about something that already happened that you're like, whoa, this really changes my appreciation of what's going on. Like, for instance, back in December of last year, when Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, had hostage all of the rich men in Saudi Arabia at the Ritz-Carlton. And recently, Zero Hedge reported that he only got about $11 billion out of those hostages and not the $100 billion that he'd been actually looking for, which is kind of fucking interesting. I mean, it gives a new perspective on that event. I mean, Zero Hedge is doing the job. And of course, Zero Hedge is just like considered a ghetto by the mainstream media. But they get the job. They tell the facts. They never cross the line of like, you don't know if it's an opinion or not. You know instantly if it's an opinion. And the editorializing, is pessimism. That's their editorial line, pessimism. But, I prefer pessimism over being progressive, quite frankly. I love Zero Hedge. And there are a number of outfits like that. There's Naked Capitalism. There's a Boom and Bust Report. There's you just go out there and you'll find a bunch of them. And it's just a pity to me that, or it's not a pity, but it's just indicative that the legacy media just shits on them, shits on the people who, of course, are doing the job they should be doing, but don't have the capability to do because they don't have the talent to do it.
Well, if I'm going to be pessimistic about the current state of news, it's largely because the major news outfits and social media will try to ostracize, stop, and ignore the competition to the mainstream media. That's certainly frustrating, and it's certainly having a big impact. At the same time, why am I optimistic? Is because there's still fucking competition in the market, and the mainstream media is continuing to lose. And they will continue to lose, and I certainly have no problem with that. But more importantly, the competition, frankly, is producing a nice, healthy skepticism again. Yeah, I think it's very healthy that most people think, okay, there's probably some degree of shit or that the newspaper is full of, right? And, pick your newspaper, and everybody kind of knows the degree and direction of their shit and where it flows, which means that, we're kind of becoming like England is now, which at least in terms of attitude towards the newspapers, which is healthy skepticism, but they know, okay, if I go to this newspaper, I'll get the conservative view. If I go to this newspaper, I'll get the Marxist view. If I go to this paper, I'll get the liberal view. That's fine. Everybody in England knows that, the reality is somewhere in the mix.
Yeah.
And the notion that like, oh, but we should have the objective standard. It's like, well, you never had the objective standard to begin with. So don't tell me that suddenly we lost it. You didn't produce it, and you're not producing it now.
Yeah. I'm with you. I think that there is hope in this competition. The only thing I'm worried about, quite frankly, is that the legacy media winds up, especially with this Article 13 shit, winds up doing an end run on the competition and manages to squash the competition. That I worry about. And because it seems that so much of the governments and so much of the big tech corporations want to help the mainstream media squash the competition. Because, from the point of view of the elites, right, both business and in government, the mainstream media is their favorite pet because they can put out their propaganda, the news as they see it, any way they want to, and they're going to get a reporter who will just be a note taker. They're not going to they're not going to question the narrative. Okay. And so, of course, the powers that be in government and in private corporations want to keep the mainstream media. And so there is a motivation for these people to quash outside dissident news organizations. And so we have to take care of these dissident news organizations by way of money, donating to them. I mean, all the people that I've mentioned, you should donate to them. Donate to them and help them endure. Because I think personally it's going to get a lot worse against these dissident news outlets. I think that as the 2020 election comes nearer, there's going to be a more concerted effort to squash self-conscious news people, self-conscious dissident news people like Tim Pool, people like Luke Rutkowski, that they're going to go out of their way to quash them. Precisely because they're telling the truth. You see what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. I have no doubt that the mainstream media business apparatus will try to Hail Mary pass a la the Article 13 measure to save their own ass. No doubt. But here's something I'll say, which contrary to my previous posts about saying, like, I am annoyed with libertarianism, I'll give them this one critique. With any notion of central planning, it's impossible to centrally plan away the existence of a black market. It will always appear. Same thing with the media outlet. As much as they want to centralize their control, a black market appears. The samizdat market always figures out a way to show out. It's like where there's a will, there's a way. There's enough pressure to demand it.
Yeah.
They'll lose out because you can't. It's very hard to control every last channel of controllability. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's a losing game for them. It's just like it's same thing like any business. No company is ever going to be like, I'm always going to be the biggest, baddest motherfucker here, and I'll never stop. Go down a list of every big company that ever existed.
Yeah. It's like cupping water in your hand. Yeah, you'll be able to cup a bit of water, but a lot of it is going to drain away between your fingers. Yeah. And so let's hope that that's the future of the news organizations, and some of these people who are doing actual news get to survive and flourish. But let's hope that they never develop this hubris that the mainstream media has. And so, yeah, let's call it a podcast. This has been the Coach and Benway Show, talking about journalism. Dr. Benway, would you like to leave us with the final word of the podcast?
And that's the way it was.
Yes. Thank you very much for listening, and we will catch you next time. Take it easy.